They said his heart was as cold as the grave, but the truth was, he simply couldn't hear it beating. For 37 years, Lorenzo Valenti had lived in a vacuum, a silent film where the world moved in frantic, colorful chaos, yet made no sound at all. He was the phantom king of the city's underbelly, a man who controlled the docks, the high-rises, and the shadowed alleys without ever whispering a command. His power didn't roar, it suffocated. But this morning, in the golden light of a Tuesday that looked like any other, the silence that had protected him, the silence that had defined him, was about to be shattered by the trembling hands of a woman he had never truly looked at before. Stay with me, because the miracle you are about to witness is not the end of the story. It is the spark that lights a fuse of betrayal so deep it will burn this city to the ground. Before we step into the quiet storm of the Valenti estate, make sure you like this video. Hit that subscribe button and comment down below with your country's flag, so I know where my storytellers are tuning in from. Now, let's step into the silence. Lorenzo Enzo Valenti did not just own the city. He was the gravity that held it together. While other leaders in the hierarchy shouted orders and brandished weapons to demand respect, Enzo sat in the center of the storm, perfectly still. He was a predator who hunted with his eyes. He could read the tremor in a rival's lip from across a banquet hall. He could feel the heavy, erratic vibration of a lie through the mahogany of his conference table. His deafness was not a weakness. He had forged it into his most dangerous weapon. It made him unreadable. It made him a myth. When you cannot hear a man beg, you cannot be swayed by his desperation, and that terrifying indifference had built an empire of absolute obedience. The Valenti estate was a monument to this cold perfection. Perched high above the harbor, it was a sprawling fortress of white stone and reinforced glass, designed to look like a palace, but function like a vault. Inside, the air was always cool, smelling of lemon oil and old money. The staff moved through the corridors like shadows, trained to be neither seen nor heard, a rule that was strictly enforced not for the sake of noise, which Enzo could not perceive, but for the sake of order. Visual chaos was the only thing that could disturb his peace. He required stillness. He required a world that made sense to his eyes because his ears had failed him since the day he was born. Or so he had been told. Enzo sat in his private study, a cavernous room on the top floor with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city he had conquered. The morning sun was harsh, cutting across the room in jagged beams, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a silent ballet that only he seemed to appreciate. He was reviewing the weekly ledgers, his fingers tracing the columns of numbers that represented shipping alliances and territory agreements. He drank his espresso black, the bitter taste a grounding sensation in a life devoid of auditory input. He was a man entirely alone, even when surrounded by an army of guards. That was until the heavy oak door eased open. Tiana entered the room with the caution of someone stepping into a lion's den. She had been working at the Valenti estate for less than a week, a replacement for a maid who had been dismissed for moving too frantically in Enzo's peripheral vision. Tiana was different. She was a woman who carried the weight of her own history in the slope of her shoulders, a quiet dignity that seemed to anchor her to the floor. She had dark, soulful eyes that had seen enough of the world's cruelty to know when to make herself invisible. Her skin, a deep, radiant bronze, caught the sunlight as she moved toward the bookshelves, her presence almost spectral. She had been briefed by the head housekeeper, a stern woman with a clipboard and a permanent scowl. The rules were simple. Do not engage. Do not block his line of sight. Do not expect a greeting. Tiana had nodded, needing this job more than she feared the man who provided it. The rumors in the city painted Enzo as a monster, a ruthless kingpin who dissolved his enemies in the dead of night. But as Tiana watched him from the corner of her eye, dusting the spine of a leather-bound encyclopedia, she didn't see a monster. She saw a man trapped inside a glass box. Enzo knew she was there. He felt the subtle vibration of the door closing, a tremor so faint only a lifetime of sensory compensation could detect it. He didn't look up. He tracked her reflection in the darkened glass of the window. She was efficient. Her movements were fluid, rhythmic, lacking the jagged nervousness of the others. She wiped the surfaces with a deliberate grace, respecting the sanctity of his space. He appreciated that. For a man who lived by visual cues, grace was a language of respect. Tiana moved closer to the desk, her cloth gliding over the side table where an antique globe rested. She was close enough now to smell his cologne, sandalwood, and cold steel. She glanced at him, her heart hammering a rhythm against her ribs that she prayed he couldn't sense. He was handsome in a severe, terrifying way. Sharp jawline, hair black as midnight, and eyes the color of a stormy sea gray, turbulent, and focused entirely on the papers before him. But as she stepped around him to reach the heavy velvet drapes, something caught her eye. It was a small detail, something so minute that 100 people would have missed it. The morning light was hitting the side of his face at a sharp angle, illuminating the curve of his ear. Tiana froze. Her hand, holding the dusting cloth, stopped in midair. She wasn't just a maid. In another life, before the debts and the bad luck and the struggle to survive in a city that ate the poor alive, she had helped her grandmother, a healer in their community. She had learned to look at the body not as a machine, but as a garden that needed tending. She knew the signs of sickness, of blockage, of things that didn't belong. She leaned in slightly, her breath catching in her throat. There, deep in the canal of Enzo's right ear, was a shadow. It wasn't the darkness of an empty tunnel, it was a solid, impacted mess. It was waxy and dark, an obstruction so old and so dense it looked like part of his skin. She blinked, her mind racing. It looked like a buildup, a severe impaction of cerumen that had hardened over years, perhaps decades. She looked at the man. The deaf boss. The man who had never heard a sunset or a symphony. A war began in Tiana's chest. The smart thing to do, the safe thing to do, was to finish her work, back out of the room, and collect her paycheck. Touching Lorenzo Valenti was a death sentence. Invading his personal space was an act of aggression. But her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, a reminder that to see suffering and do nothing was a sin of the soul. She looked at the blockage again. If that was what she thought it wasn't just wax. It was a wall. A wall that could be brought down. Enzo sensed the stillness. The rhythmic motion of her cleaning had stopped. The disruption in the pattern triggered his internal alarm. He lifted his head slowly, his gray eyes locking onto her with the intensity of a weapon calibrating its target. He found Tiana standing mere inches from him, staring not at his face, but at the side of his head. Her expression was baffling. It wasn't the fear he was used to. It wasn't the seductive manipulation he often saw from women trying to get close to his money. It was curiosity. And beneath that, a profound, aching sadness. Tiana saw him tense. She saw his hand twitch toward the top drawer of his desk where she knew a loaded firearm rested. She knew she had seconds to explain, but she couldn't use words. He wouldn't hear them. She took a breath that shook her entire frame. She stepped closer. Enzo's eyes widened slightly. This was insubordination. This was madness. No one approached him like this. But he didn't draw the weapon. There was something in her eyes, a desperate, pleading honesty that froze his reaction. She wasn't attacking, she was asking. Tiana raised her hand slowly, displaying her empty palm to show she held no weapon. Then, with a trembling finger, she pointed to his ear. She pursed her lips and tapped her own ear, then shook her head, miming a blockage. She pointed at him again, her eyebrows knitting together in an expression of intense focus. Enzo stared at her. He felt a phantom sensation, a dull pressure he had ignored for so long it had become part of his anatomy. He watched her lips move. She was whispering, words he couldn't decipher, but the vibration of her voice seemed to ripple through the air between them. "Let me see," she seemed to be saying. "Let me help." It was the most absurd, dangerous moment of his life. He was the head of the Valenti family. He did not submit to examinations by the cleaning staff. He should ring the bell beneath his desk and have Dario drag her out. But the look in her eyes anchored him. It was a look of recognition. She saw him. Not the boss, not the myth, but the man. Slowly, terrifyingly, Enzo nodded. Tiana let out a breath she felt she had been holding for years. She looked around the desk, her eyes landing on a small, silver letter opener and then a box of tissues. No, that was too sharp. She needed something else. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, sealed packet of sterile cotton swabs she kept for detailing the intricate carvings on the furniture. It wasn't medical grade, but it was soft. She stepped into his personal space. The heat radiating from him was intense. She could smell the starch of his collar and the metallic scent of danger that clung to him. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder to steady him. Enzo flinched. The contact was electric. He wasn't touched. Not like this. Not with gentleness. His intimate encounters were transactions, devoid of emotion, usually ending as quickly as they began. This touch was different. It was authoritative yet kind. It demanded trust. Tiana bent down, angling her face to see clearly into the canal. Up close, the blockage was undeniable. It was a plug of oxidized wax, hard as stone, sealing the canal completely. How had no doctor seen this? How had a man with his resources gone decades with a simple mechanical obstruction? She worked the cotton tip gently, not jamming it in, but using a circular motion to loosen the edges. Enzo gripped the armrests of his leather chair, his knuckles turning white. He felt a strange, uncomfortable fullness, a shifting of tectonic plates inside his skull. It was a sensation of invasion, but he forced himself to remain still, surrendering to the hands of this woman whose name he couldn't even remember reading on the staff list. Tiana bit her lip, focusing entirely on the task. She needed to create a gap. She needed to break the seal. She maneuvered the swab, applying a pressure that was firm but careful. She felt the resistance of the mass. It was stubborn, entrenched. She adjusted her angle, using her thumb to pull his ear up and back, straightening the canal. Then she felt it give. There was a wet, sticky sound, a suction breaking that only she heard. The mass shifted. With a delicate, scooping motion, she coaxed it outward. It was slow, painstaking work, extracting years of silence inch by inch. Enzo squeezed his eyes shut, a hiss of breath escaping his teeth as the pressure in his head spiked and then, suddenly, vanished. Tiana pulled her hand back. Resting on the tip of the swab was a dark, dense plug, the size of a marble. It was ugly, a physical manifestation of the barrier that had separated Enzo from humanity. She looked at his face. Enzo's eyes snapped open. The first thing that hit him was not a sound, but a feeling. A rush of cold air flooded into his ear canal, hitting a tympanic membrane that hadn't felt a direct breeze since he was a child. It was a physical shock, like plunging into ice water. He gasped, his hands flying up to clutch the sides of his head. And then, the world came rushing in. Whoosh! It was the sound of his own intake of breath. It sounded like a hurricane. It was ragged, harsh, and incredibly loud. He froze, the air caught in his lungs. He exhaled. Hoa! The sound vibrated in his throat, echoing in his own skull. He stared at the desk, his eyes wide with a terror that was rapidly bleeding into awe. What was that? Was that him? Tiana watched him, tears pricking her eyes. She saw the realization crash over him. She didn't move, she barely breathed, terrified of breaking the spell. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Enzo whipped his head toward the corner of the room. The grandfather clock. The ornate, mahogany sentinel that had stood there for 20 years. He had watched its pendulum swing 1,000,000 times, a silent metronome of his life. Now it was screaming at him. The rhythmic mechanical strike of metal on metal was sharp, precise, and deafeningly beautiful. It wasn't just marking time, it was singing it. He turned back to the front, his senses reeling. The leather of his chair groaned as he shifted his weight, a low, animalistic creak. He rubbed his thumb against his fingers, hearing the dry rasp of skin on skin. These were microscopic sounds, the background static of existence that everyone else ignored, but to Lorenzo Valenti, they were a symphony of revelation. He looked up at Tiana. She was standing with her hands clasped over her mouth, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She looked at the wax on the napkin, then back at him, offering a shaky, tentative smile. Enzo opened his mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, to ask what magic she had performed. But when he engaged his vocal cords, the sound that emerged wasn't the flat, monotone vibration he had learned to produce through years of speech therapy. It was a voice. A deep, resonant baritone that rumbled in his chest and filled the room. He stopped. The sound of the word hung in the air, vibrating against the walls. He had heard himself. He had heard his own existence. He stood up, his legs trembling. He walked to the window. The glass that had always been a silent barrier was now vibrating. He could hear a low, distant hum. He pressed his hand against the pane. Outside, far below, the city was alive. The distant wail of a siren. The guttural roar of a ship's horn in the harbor. The chaotic, beautiful noise of life. He turned back to Tiana, his face a mask of shock that was slowly cracking into something else. Vulnerability. He whispered. The word was rough, unpolished, but it was clear. You did this. Tiana nodded, a tear finally escaping and tracking a path down her cheek. It was just blocked, sir, she whispered. Enzo flinched. He heard her. He didn't read her lips. He didn't feel the floor shake. He heard the soft, melodic timbre of her voice. It was like music. It was the sweetest thing he had ever encountered. It was just blocked. The words replayed in his mind, looping over and over. But as the initial wave of euphoria began to crest, a darker tide began to rise beneath it. He looked at the small, dark mass sitting on the tissue on his desk. That little thing. That insignificant piece of waste had cost him everything. It had cost him his mother's last words. It had cost him the sound of his first love's laughter. It had cost him the ability to know when an assassin was creeping up behind him in the dark. For 37 years, he had been examined by the best doctors money could buy. Dr. Sterling, the family physician, the man who sat at his dinner table, the man who had looked into his ears 100 times and shaken his head with sad, professional resignation. The nerves are dead, Enzo. There is nothing to be done. Enzo's breathing shifted. The wonder in his inhale was replaced by the jagged, rasping sound of fury. The clock continued to tick, but now it sounded like a countdown. If Tiana, a maid with a cotton swab, could fix him in 30 seconds, then Dr. Sterling hadn't missed it. He had ignored it. The silence of the room was gone, replaced by the roar of blood rushing in Enzo's ears. It was the sound of a betrayal so profound it threatened to stop his heart. He looked at Tiana, his eyes hardening, the gray turning to slate. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating look of the dawn. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice gaining strength, the command inherent in his tone. "Tiana," she whispered. "Tiana," he repeated, tasting the sound of the syllables. "You have given me a gift, Tiana. But now..." He walked toward his desk, his footsteps clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, click, 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 a sound of approaching judgment. He reached for the phone. "Now I have to make a call." He didn't look at the phone as he dialed. He listened to the tones. Beep, beep, beep. Each one was a distinct note in the melody of his revenge. He held the receiver to his ear, his good ear, his new ear. The dial tone purred. Then it rang. Once. Twice. Dr. Sterling speaking, a voice answered. Enzo closed his eyes. He recognized the voice. He had watched those lips move for 20 years. But hearing the tone, the arrogance, the comfort, the safety in that voice, sparked a rage in Enzo that was hotter than any fire. The most dangerous man in the city can finally hear the lies surrounding him. And he is about to realize that his silence wasn't a medical condition, it was a prison built by the people he trusted most. What happens when a predator realizes he's been kept in a cage? You think you know violence? You think you know revenge? You haven't seen anything yet. Smash that subscribe button right now because you need to know what happens next. The doctor is on the line and Enzo Valenti is about to speak his first words of war. Mr. Valenti? The voice on the other end of the line was clipped, professional, and laced with a subtle irritation that Enzo had never detected when he was merely reading lips. Is everything all right? You don't usually utilize the personal line during business hours. Enzo held the phone tighter, the plastic creaking under his grip creak, a sound he registered with a jolt of fresh adrenaline. He closed his eyes, savoring the bitter flavor of the doctor's tone. For 23 years, he had watched Alistair's sterling smile, nod, and pat his arm with paternal reassurance. He had seen a friend. Now, listening to the man's actual voice, he heard something else entirely. He heard the oily slide of condescension. He heard the comfort of a man who believed he was speaking to a broken instrument that could never play a tune. Alistair, Enzo said. The name felt foreign in his mouth, a heavy stone he had to push past his teeth. His voice was a low, seismic rumble, rough from disuse, but terrifyingly steady. There was a pause on the other end. A silence that wasn't empty, but heavy with confusion. Enzo could hear the doctor's breath hitch, a tiny, sharp intake of air. Hup. Enzo. Sterling's voice shifted, the irritation replaced by a flicker of unease. Your voice, you sound different. Is your throat bothering you? I can have a specialist. I need to see you, Enzo interrupted, the command rolling out of him like thunder. Tonight. 6 o'clock. The clinic. Tonight? Enzo, surely this can wait. I have a fundraiser for the hospital board, and my wife is expecting. 6 o'clock, Enzo repeated. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply let the weight of his authority drop through the phone line. Or I will send Dario to pick you up. And you know Dario doesn't like traffic. The threat hung in the air, vibrating between them. Enzo could hear the doctor swallow a wet, nervous click in the back of his throat. It was the sound of a prey animal realizing the wind had shifted. Of course, Sterling said, his voice tight. I'll clear my schedule. 6 o'clock. Enzo pulled the phone away from his ear and pressed the red button. Beep. The call ended, but the echo of the doctor's fear lingered in the room. Enzo stood there for a long moment, the silence of the study returning, but it was no longer a void. It was alive. The hum of the air conditioning unit in the ceiling was a constant, low-frequency drone. The wind outside battered the glass with soft, rhythmic thuds. Even the settling of the building's foundation made groans that spoke of age and weight. He turned slowly to Tiana. She hadn't moved. She stood near the bookshelf, her hands still clasped together, watching him with wide, terrified eyes. She had just witnessed a resurrection, but she also knew she was standing in the cage of a tiger that had just woken up. Enzo looked at her, really looked at her. He realized now that her beauty wasn't just in the symmetry of her face, but in the quietness of her presence. In a world that was suddenly screaming with noise, she was a soft melody. You were afraid, Enzo stated. It wasn't a question. He could hear it in her breathing, shallow, rapid, like a bird trapped in a house. Hiff-huff, hiff-huff. I don't want to cause trouble, sir, Tiana whispered, her voice trembling like a violin string. I just thought. You didn't cause trouble, Enzo said, taking a step toward her. The sound of his Italian leather shoes on the marble floor was sharp clack, clack, dominating the space. You caused the truth. Do you know what they say about the truth, Tiana? She shook her head, unable to speak. They say it sets you free, Enzo murmured, stopping just inches from her. But they forget to mention that first, it destroys everything you thought you knew. He reached out, and for a moment, Tiana flinched, expecting a strike. Instead, Enzo's hand hovered near her face, not touching, but close enough to feel the heat. Go back to your quarters, he commanded, his voice softening, though the edge of steel remained. Stay there. Do not speak to anyone. Do not tell the head housekeeper what happened here. If anyone asks, you are cleaning the drapes. Do you understand? Yes, sir, she breathed. Tiana, he added, stopping her as she turned to leave. Thank you. The words were clumsy, unpracticed, but they carried a weight that made Tiana's knees weak. She nodded once, a quick, jerky motion, and fled the room. Enzo listened to her go. He heard the rustle of her uniform, the soft pad of her rubber-soled shoes on the carpet of the hallway, the click of the heavy door latching shut. Click. Alone again. Enzo turned to the safe hidden behind the oil painting of his father. He spun the dial. Work-click. 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 The combination locks tumbled into place with a satisfying, mechanical finality. He pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside lay the skeleton of his empire. Stacks of cash, deeds to properties, and the black ledgers that contained the names of everyone on the Valenti payroll. He pulled out the ledger marked medical and personal retainers. He carried the heavy book to his desk and flipped it open. The pages crinkled, shhh, dry and brittle. He ran his finger down the columns until he found it. Dr. Alistair Sterling. The monthly retainer was exorbitant. It always had been. Enzo had justified it because of his special condition. He needed discretion. He needed a doctor who would come to the house at 2 a.m. He needed someone who understood the silence. But as he looked at the numbers now, the math changed. These weren't medical fees. This was hush money. He traced the dates. The payments had spiked 10 years ago. Why? What happened 10 years ago? He closed his eyes, letting the newly acquired sounds of the room fade as he dove into his memory. 10 years ago, he had almost been killed. A rival family, the Morettas, had planted a bomb in his car. He had survived only because he had seen the reflection of the device in a shop window moments before opening the door. After the attempt, he had suffered severe headaches. Dr. Sterling had treated him daily for months, administering injections to calm the nerves and preserve what little hearing sensitivity he had left. Enzo's eyes snapped open. The injections. Every time he had complained of pressure in his ears, Sterling had given him a shot. Every time he felt a pop or a shift, Sterling was there with drops, with gauze, with reassurance. It's just the inflammation, Enzo. Let me handle it. He hadn't been treating the deafness. He had been maintaining it. He had been packing the canal, layer by layer, year by year, ensuring the wall remained intact. Enzo slammed the ledger shut. Thud. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. He needed backup. He needed the one man who had been his shadow for 2 decades. But could he trust him? If the doctor was a liar, who else? He reached for the phone again and dialed a single number. Yeah, boss. Dario's voice. Rough, like gravel in a cement mixer. It was exactly how Enzo had imagined it, yet hearing the actual timbre of it sent a chill down his spine. There was a weariness in it, a jagged edge of exhaustion. Dario, Enzo said. Boss? Dario's tone shifted instantly. Alert. Dangerous. What's wrong? You sound weird. You sick? Report, Enzo said, keeping his sentences short, testing the waters. We cleared the shipment at the East Docks. The Russians are asking for a higher percentage, but I told them to take a walk. And, we got a problem with the new guy, Ricci. He's skimming. I was gonna handle it tonight. Enzo listened. Not to the words, but to the background. He could hear wind. He could hear the distant honk of a car. He could hear the flick of a lighter, flick, whoosh, and the sharp inhale of a cigarette. Where are you? Enzo asked. I'm outside the warehouse. Just finishing a smoke. Come to the house. Now. Take the car. I need a ride. A ride? To where? I thought you were staying in tonight. Plans change, Enzo said coldly. And Dario? Yeah, boss. Don't finish that cigarette. Enzo hung up. He realized with a dark satisfaction that Dario hadn't questioned how Enzo knew he was smoking. The lieutenant probably assumed Enzo had seen him on a security camera feed, or that he was watching from a window. He didn't know that the game had changed. He didn't know that Enzo was now playing with a full deck. While he waited, Enzo walked into the bathroom attached to his study. He turned on the faucet. Gush! The water roared into the porcelain basin. It was deafening. He stared at his reflection in the mirror. He looked the same. The same sharp cheekbones, the same gray eyes. But the man staring back was different. He cupped his hands under the water and splashed his face. The sound of the water hitting his skin was a chaotic splash. He grabbed a towel. The fabric rustled against his ears, scratch, loud and abrasive. Everything was too much. The world was too loud. It was a cacophony of scraping, banging, whirring, and humming. How did people live like this? How did they think with all this noise? It was exhausting. But it was also exhilarating. It was the sound of power. Half an hour later, a knock at the door. Knock. 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 Enter, Enzo said. The door opened and Dario stepped in. He was a mountain of a man, built like a tank, with a scar running through his left eyebrow. He was wearing a leather jacket that creaked with every movement. Dario stopped dead when he saw Enzo. He looked the boss up and down, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "You okay, Enzo? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I heard one," Enzo said cryptically. He walked over to his coat rack and grabbed his long, black wool coat. He swung it over his shoulders. Whoosh. "The car. Is it ready?" "Yeah, it's downstairs." "Where are we going?" Enzo turned to him, buttoning his coat. He paused, looking at Dario's heavy boots. He could hear the man shifting his weight. Squeak. Squeak. "Dr. Sterling's office," Enzo said. Dario frowned. "The doc? You sick? You want me to call him to come here?" "No," Enzo said, walking past him. "House calls are over. It's time for a second opinion." The drive to the city center was a sensory assault, and for Dario, it was the strangest drive of his life. Enzo sat in the back of the armored SUV, but he wasn't doing his usual routine of reading files or staring blankly out the window. He was twitchy. The engine of the SUV was a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through the seat and into Enzo's spine. The tires hummed against the asphalt, a high-pitched drone that changed pitch as they accelerated. Vroom. "What is that noise?" Enzo asked suddenly, his voice sharp. Dario glanced in the rearview mirror, confused. "What noise, boss?" "That squeak. It's high-pitched. It's coming from the dashboard." Dario frowned, straining his ears. "I don't hear nothing, boss." "Maybe it's the suspension?" "It's an old truck." "It's not the suspension," Enzo snapped, rubbing his temple. "It's plastic rubbing on plastic. It's excruciating. Fix it tomorrow." Dario blinked. Enzo Valenti, the man who had lived through bombings without flinching, was complaining about a squeaky dashboard? Sure thing, boss. I'll get the mechanic on it." They drove in silence for another mile, but the city outside was screaming. A police siren wailed in the distance, a mournful, undulating cry that made Enzo grit his teeth. A group of teenagers on a corner were laughing, a harsh, cackling sound. A bus hissed as it kneeled at a stop PSHHT. Enzo absorbed it all. He was building a library of sounds. He was cataloging the world he was about to conquer. But it was overwhelming. Then a low, rhythmic sound began to fill the car. It was coming from the front seat. Did-a-dum. Enzo leaned forward. "Dario." "Yeah, boss." "Are you humming?" Dario turned red. He stopped immediately. "Sorry, boss. Just songs stuck in my head. Tiny dancer. You know how it is." Enzo stared at the back of Dario's head. He had worked with this man for 20 years. He had trusted him with his life. And he had never known that Dario hummed Elton John songs when he was nervous. It was absurd. It was human. And, for a split second, it was almost funny. "You're off-key," Enzo said dryly, leaning back into the shadows. Dario's eyes went wide in the mirror. He opened his mouth to ask how the hell Enzo knew what key he was in, or that he was humming at all, but he shut it again. The boss was in a mood tonight. Best not to poke the bear. "Whatever you say, boss," Dario muttered. "Hey, about Ricci, the guy skimming. You want me to clip him? Or just break some fingers?" Enzo listened to the casual violence in Dario's voice. It was spoken with the same tone one might use to order a sandwich. It was brutal, efficient, and loyal. Dario was a blunt instrument. He wasn't the architect of the betrayal. He was just the hammer. "Hold off on Ricci," Enzo said. "We might have bigger problems to clean up tonight." "Bigger than skimming?" "Who's the problem?" "A breach of contract," Enzo said softly. "A very old contract." They arrived at the medical building at 5:55 p.m. The structure was steel and glass, towering over the financial district. It looked sterile, clean, reputable. A perfect place to hide a dirty secret. Dario parked the SUV at the curb. "I'm coming up with you." "No," Enzo said. "Wait here. If I'm not down in 30 minutes, then you come up. And if you come up, bring the bag." Dario's eyes narrowed. The bag contained the tools they used for interrogations that required privacy and plastic sheeting. "Understood, boss." Enzo stepped out of the car. The street noise hit him instantly, a physical wave of sound. He adjusted his collar and walked toward the revolving doors. Whoosh thump. Whoosh thump. The lobby was polished marble. His footsteps echoed. Click-clack. Click-clack. He walked past the security guard, who nodded nervously. Enzo didn't nod back. He was focused on the elevator. He pressed the button. Ding. The doors slid open. He stepped inside. He was alone. The doors closed, sealing him in a small, humming metal box. He watched the numbers climb. 1, 2, 3. His heart was beating in his ears. Thump-thump. Thump-thump. It was the loudest thing in the world. He was terrified. Not of the doctor, but of the anger that was boiling inside him. He felt like a bomb that had just been armed. The elevator stopped on the 15th floor. Ding. The doors opened. The reception area was empty, the lights dimmed for the evening. But down the hall, a single door was ajar, spilling a slice of yellow light onto the carpet. Enzo could hear movement inside. He could hear the shuffling of papers. Swish, swish. He could hear the clinking of glass. Clink. And he could hear humming. A low, nervous, off-key humming. Dr. Sterling was waiting. Enzo stepped out of the elevator. He didn't sneak. He didn't hide. He walked down the center of the hallway, letting his footsteps announce his arrival. He wanted the doctor to hear him coming. He wanted the fear to build. He reached the door and pushed it open. Dr. Sterling was standing by a cabinet, pouring a drink. His hand was shaking. The crystal decanter rattled against the glass. He spun around as Enzo entered, spilling amber liquid onto his pristine white cuff. Enzo. Sterling forced a smile that looked like a rictus of pain. You're punctual. I value time, Alistair, Enzo said, his voice filling the room, bouncing off the walls, leaving no corner for the doctor to hide in. Especially the time I have lost. Enzo closed the door behind him. Click. He locked it. Ka-chunk. Sterling's eyes darted to the lock, then back to Enzo. Is that necessary? We're just having a checkup. This isn't a checkup, Enzo said, walking slowly toward the desk. He stopped and picked up a model of the human ear that sat on the corner. He ran his thumb over the plastic canal. This is an audit. If you are enjoying this story, if you are feeling the tension in this room right now, do me a favor, hit that like button. It tells YouTube that you want more stories like this. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? The truth is about to come out, and you do not want to miss the finale. Enzo dropped the plastic ear onto the desk. It clattered loudly. Sit down, doctor, Enzo commanded. We need to talk about what you found in my ears for the last 20 years. And more importantly, we need to talk about who paid you to ignore it. Sterling collapsed into his chair, his face draining of color. The silence in the room was heavy, but this time, Enzo could hear every breathless whimper of the man who had stolen his life. Sit, Enzo repeated. The word was not a shout, it was a gavel strike, final and absolute. Dr. Sterling sank into the leather chair, the springs groaning under his weight re-yunk, a sound of surrender that Enzo registered with fascinating clarity. He looked small. The man who had held the power of medical divinity over Enzo for decades, the man whose white coat had been a shield of invincibility, was now shrinking under the weight of his own deceit. Sweat beaded on his forehead, glistening under the fluorescent lights that hummed above them with a maddening, insectal buzz, zzzzzzzzzt. A sound Enzo had never known existed, but one that now felt like it was drilling directly into his teeth. You're going to tell me a story, Alistair, Enzo said, walking slowly to the window and turning his back on the doctor. He looked out at the city, a sprawling grid of light and shadow. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening. He could hear the wind howling between the skyscrapers, a mournful, hollow whistle. He could hear the distant, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter rotor miles away. And unlike the fairy tales you've told me since I was a boy, tales of dead nerves and hopeless diagnoses, this one is going to have a villain. A real one. And if you lie, I will hear it. Enzo turned around, his face a mask of terrifying calm. I will hear your heart skip, Alistair. I will hear your breath catch in your throat like a trapped bird. I will hear the fabric of your expensive suit rustle when you shift in discomfort. I am listening to your fear. He took a step closer, his shoes clicking against the linoleum, clack, clack, a metronome counting down the doctor's remaining moments of freedom. Who paid you? Sterling stammered, his hands shaking so badly that his signet ring tapped against the armrest. Tap, tap, tap. Enzo, please. You don't understand. It was complicated. The family, the politics, your father's enemies were everywhere. My father is dead. Enzo roared. The volume of his own voice startled him, reverberating in his chest like a war drum, bouncing off the sterile walls and filling the room with raw, acoustic power. He hadn't known he was capable of such thunder. Do not hide behind ghosts. This started when I was 14. 14, Alistair. I sat in this very chair, a scared boy, and you looked in my ear and lied. Who approached you? Who told you to pack my ear with wax and tell me my nerves were dead? Who wanted a deaf king? Sterling was weeping now. It wasn't the dignified silence of a man accepting his fate. It was ugly, messy. Hooah. Hooah. The wet, guttural sounds of his sobs grated on Enzo's new senses. It was the sound of a coward. It was for your protection, Sterling blubbered, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. Protection? Enzo stepped closer, looming over the desk. You let a wax buildup steal my life for protection? It wasn't just buildup, Sterling stammered, his eyes darting to the medical cabinet. The injections, Enzo. They weren't vitamins. They were localized anesthetics to numb the canal. And then, I packed it. Synthetic compound mixed with wax. Every month, when you came for your cleaning, I wasn't taking things out. I was packing it in tighter. I built that wall brick by brick. Enzo felt the bile rise in his throat. It wasn't nature. It wasn't bad luck. It was architecture. Who? Enzo asked, his voice a low vibration that shook the glass on the desk. Who ordered you to build a prison inside my head? Your uncle, Sterling whispered. The name came out as a hiss of escaping air. Salvatore. The name hung in the room, sucking the oxygen out of the space. Salvatore. Uncle Sal. The man who had taken Enzo in when his parents' car went off the bridge. The man who had sat by his bedside when he had lost his hearing. The man who had taught him how to tie a tie, how to pour wine, how to sign contracts. The man who sat at the head of the table every Sunday, smiling that warm, benevolent smile while breaking bread with the nephew he had mutilated. Enzo felt the world tilt on its axis. It wasn't a rival family. It wasn't the Russians or the Triads. It wasn't an enemy at the gates. It was the architect of his life. Salvatore had crippled him not to protect him, but to control him. He had manufactured a disability to ensure Enzo would always need a translator, always need a guide, always be the figurehead while Salvatore pulled the strings from the shadows. Enzo was never the boss, he was the puppet and his silence was the strings. Enzo looked at the doctor with a cold, absolute detachment. The rage that had been burning hot, pulsing in his temples with a thump-thump-thump rhythm, suddenly crystallized into ice. He didn't feel angry anymore. He felt efficient. Dario, Enzo said, speaking to the closed door. He didn't raise his voice. He knew Dario was listening. The door swung open instantly, swish. Dario stood there, filling the frame, his leather jacket groaning as he crossed his arms. He looked from the weeping doctor to Enzo, his eyes narrowing. He didn't need an explanation. He saw the betrayal hanging in the air like smoke. Take Dr. Sterling, Enzo said, his voice flat, devoid of the humanity he had just regained. He is retiring. Tonight. Enzo, no. Please. Sterling scrambled back, his chair rolling away and hitting the wall with a dull thud. He knocked over his crystal decanter in his panic. Crash. The sound of shattering glass was explosive, a symphony of destruction that made Enzo wince. Shards skittered across the floor, tinkle, tinkle, sparkling under the lights. I raised you. I helped you. I kept you safe. You didn't help me, Enzo said, turning away to look at the anatomy chart on the wall, refusing to give the man the dignity of eye contact. You muted me. Dario stepped forward. He didn't run. He moved with the inevitable momentum of a glacier. He placed a heavy hand on Sterling's shoulder. There was no struggle, just the shuffling of feet and the soft, terrified whimpering of a man meeting his fate. Let's go, Doc, Dario grunted, his voice a low rumble. I got a nice spot by the docks. Very quiet. You'll like it. The seagulls are loud this time of year, but you won't mind. They left. Enzo stood alone in the office for a long moment, listening to the fading footsteps in the hallway. Click-clack, then the ding of the elevator, and then silence. He walked to the desk, picked up the phone that Sterling had used to summon him so many times. He wrapped the cord around his hand. With a sharp jerk, he ripped it from the wall. Rip. The plastic jack snapped with a sharp crack. It was a satisfying sound. A sound of disconnection. Now, for the main event. The drive back to the mansion was a revelation. Enzo didn't sit in the back. He demanded the keys from Dario before the lieutenant left with the doctor. He needed to drive. He needed to feel the machine. He climbed into the driver's seat of the armored SUV. The door closed with a heavy, pressurized thump, sealing him inside. He pressed the ignition button. Vroom. The engine roared to life, a beast waking up. The vibration traveled up the steering column and into Enzo's palms. He arrived at the estate gates 20 minutes later. The guards waved him through, unaware that the wolf was now driving the sheep's car. He parked at the front entrance. The engine ticked as it cooled, tick, tick, tick. Enzo entered the foyer, but before he could head to the library to confront his uncle, he stopped. He heard a voice coming from the staff hallway. A voice that was deep, rough, and laced with threat. "I'ma skin you one more time, sweetheart," the voice growled. "What did you do to the boss? He's acting crazy. He's hearing things. Did you drug him? Did you poison him?" It was Dario. He had returned from the docks faster than expected, and he had gone straight for the weakest link. Or so he thought. Enzo moved silently toward the sound. He turned the corner and saw Dario towering over Tiana. She was backed against the wall, her eyes wide with fear, clutching a laundry basket like a shield. Dario wasn't hurting her, but he was looming, using his size to intimidate. "I didn't do anything," Tiana cried, her voice trembling. "I just cleaned. I just helped him." "Helped him how?" Dario stepped closer, his leather jacket squeaking. "You think you can just walk in here and—" "Dario," Enzo said. The word was barely a whisper, but Dario spun around as if he'd been shot. He stared at Enzo, then back at Tiana, then back at Enzo. "Boss? I was just checking her out. Making sure she ain't a spy. You've been acting weird, and she's the new variable." Enzo walked forward, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He stepped between Dario and Tiana, placing himself as a physical barrier. He looked Dario in the eye. "She is not a spy, Dario," Enzo said, his voice low and dangerous. "She is the only person in this house who has ever told me the truth." Dario blinked, confused. "But boss, the ears, the way you're driving, what did she do?" "She opened the door," Enzo said. He turned to Tiana, his expression softening instantly. "Are you all right?" Tiana nodded, breathless. "Yes, Mr. Valenti." Enzo turned back to Dario, his face hardening. "Go to the library. Tell Uncle Sal and Ricci I am home. Tell them I want to celebrate. Tell them to open the '82 vintage. We're having a family dinner." Dario looked at Enzo, sensing the shift in power. He didn't understand it yet, but he respected it. "Celebrating? Okay, boss. Sure. Whatever you say." Dario walked away, shaking his head and muttering to himself. Enzo waited until he was gone, then looked at Tiana. "Stay here," he whispered. "Lock your door. Do not come out until I come for you." "What are you going to do?" she asked, fear for him evident in her eyes. "I am going to have dinner with my family," Enzo said, a cold smile touching his lips. "And I am going to enjoy every bite." Enzo walked to the library doors. They were heavy oak, designed to look impressive, thick enough to muffle sound for normal people, but not for a man who was straining every nerve to hear. He stopped outside the door. He leaned in, pressing his ear near the crack. "Worried about the boy?" a voice rasped. It was Sal. The voice was like sandpaper, rough and aged, filled with the phlegm of a lifetime of cigars. Enzo had never heard it before. He had only seen the lips moving, forming lies. Now he heard the texture of the malice. "He's been acting strange. That new maid, Tiana. I saw her looking at him today. Too intense." "Tiana?" another voice asked. It was Ricci. Smooth, oily, higher pitched than Enzo expected. "She's a nobody, Sal. Just a cleaner. She doesn't speak Italian. She doesn't know anything. Nobody is a nobody, Sal growled, the sound vibrating through the wood. If she gets too close, she sees things. Enzo is useful because he is isolated. He lives in a bubble. If he starts connecting with people, if he starts asking questions, the arrangement falls apart. He's a puppet, Ricci. If the puppet cuts the strings, the show is over. Maybe it's time the maid had an accident. Like the last one. Enzo's blood froze in his veins. The last one. Elena. The maid he had fired 2 years ago for clumsiness and stealing. She hadn't stolen anything. She had probably tried to tell him. She had probably signaled him, and Sal had seen it. And Sal had removed her. And Enzo? Ricci asked, the sound of liquid being poured into a glass echoing glug, glug, glug. If he becomes a problem? If the girl tells him something? Then we put him down, Sal said. The ice clinked in his glass, clink clink, a cheerful sound for a death sentence. We grieve. We wear black. We bury him next to his father in the family plot. And I take the chair officially. He's a broken dog, Ricci. Useful for barking at the neighbors, but if he tries to bite, you shoot him. Enzo had heard enough. But he wouldn't storm in. Not yet. He wanted them to feel safe. He wanted to play with his food. He opened the door with the smoothness of oil on glass. Sal and Ricci looked up. They saw Enzo standing there, his face impassive, his eyes vacant. The mask was perfect. They relaxed instantly. Their shoulders dropped. To them, he was just the furniture. He was the deaf nephew who couldn't hear their treason. Enzo. Sal smiled, waving him over, his face shifting instantly into a mask of grandfatherly love. He tapped the empty seat beside him. Come. Sit. Enzo walked into the room. He didn't sit immediately. He walked to the fire in the hearth which crackled, pop, hiss, consuming the oak logs. He warmed his hands, keeping his back to them. How are you, Uncle? Enzo asked, his voice flat. Sal signed with his hands. I am good. Tired. Old bones. But out loud, he said to Ricci, look at him. Standing there like a statue. God, it's exhausting pretending to love a cripple. Ricci chuckled. At least he dresses well. Enzo turned around and smiled. A genuine, bright smile. I'm glad you think so, Ricci. Ricci froze. Sal frowned. They exchanged a look. Did he lip read that? No, his back was turned. Coincidence. It had to be. Sit, Enzo, Sal signed. Eat. Drink. Enzo sat. The soup was served. The room, which used to be a peaceful visual tableau, was now a torture chamber. Every sound was amplified 1,000 times. The spoon hitting the porcelain bowl didn't just clink, it rang like a gunshot ping. Enzo winced, gripping the edge of the table. He watched Sal eating. The old man was a noisy eater. He didn't just eat, he demolished. Slurp. The sound of the liquid being sucked through Sal's teeth sounded like a drain unclogging. Smack. Crunch. The chewing was wet and visceral. Enzo felt a headache spiking behind his eyes. It was a physical assault. The clock on the mantel was ticking, tick. Tock, like a hammer hitting an anvil. Is the soup to your liking, Uncle? Enzo asked, his voice tight, trying to talk over the cacophony in his own head. It's delicious, Sal signed. Then he said aloud, tastes like dishwater. But the boy wouldn't know. Smack, he has no taste. Slurp, just like he has no ears. The sounds of Sal's mockery mixed with the wet chewing noises. It was too much. Enzo didn't just want revenge, he wanted silence. Enzo laughed. A sharp, barking laugh that made both men jump. What's so funny? Ricci asked, his hand drifting toward his jacket pocket. Oh, just a joke I heard today, Enzo said, leaning forward. About a wolf who dressed up as a shepherd. He thought the sheep were stupid. He thought they couldn't see his teeth. Sal stopped eating. The spoon clattered against the bowl. Cling. What are you talking about, Enzo? Sal signed, his hands shaking slightly. I'm talking about the '82 vintage, Enzo said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming the voice of the dawn. I think I prefer it. The one you're drinking. You always give me the cheap stuff, Uncle. You think I can't taste the difference, just like you thought I couldn't hear the insults. Sal's face went white. It wasn't a gradual fade. The blood simply vanished, draining away to leave him looking like a corpse. He looked at Enzo as if the devil himself had just spoken from the fires of hell. "You," Sal whispered, his voice trembling, the sandpaper grit replaced by fear. "You can." "I can hear the fire," Enzo said, standing up slowly, his movements deliberate. "I can hear the wind rattling the window panes. I can hear the whiskey dripping from the table to the floor where Ricci just dropped his glass. Drip, drip, drip. And I can hear your heart failing, Uncle. It sounds like a drum beating a retreat." Enzo walked around the table, his footsteps heavy and authoritative. Ricci, panic flaring in his eyes, jumped up and pulled the gun from under his jacket. "Don't," Enzo said, not even looking at him. "Dario is behind you." Ricci spun around. Dario had stepped out of the shadows of the hallway he had been listening to. He stood there, silent as a wraith, a silencer-equipped pistol in his hand. Click. The sound of the safety coming off was the loudest thing in the room. Enzo stopped behind Sal's chair. He placed his hands on the old man's shoulders. He could feel the tremors running through Sal's body, vibrating into Enzo's palms. He leaned down, his mouth close to the old man's ear, the ear that had worked perfectly while Enzo's had been blocked by lies. "You stole the music from me, Sal," Enzo whispered, his voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "You stole the laughter of women. You stole the warnings of friends. You stole 37 years of sound. Do you know what the price is for that?" Sal was shaking violently now. Tears streamed down his face. "Enzo, listen, please, it was for the family. I had to, you were too soft." "No," Enzo said, straightening up and releasing him. "It wasn't for the family. It was for you. You wanted to be the voice because you were afraid of what I would say." Enzo looked at Dario and nodded once. "Take them to the cellar," Enzo commanded. "The soundproofing down there is excellent. I had it installed myself for our enemies. I want to see if they can scream loud enough for me to hear them upstairs. I want to test my new ears." "Enzo!" Sal screamed as Dario grabbed him by the collar. "I'm your blood. I'm your blood. You can't do this." "My blood," Enzo said, turning his back and walking toward the fire, "is finally rushing to my ears. And it is telling me that the debt is paid." Dario dragged them out. The screams were loud, desperate, echoing through the hallway. "No. No." Enzo, and then, the heavy cellar door slammed shut. Boom. Silence returned to the library. But it was a good silence. It was a clean silence. It was the silence of a house that had been purged of its ghosts. Enzo poured himself a glass of the '82 vintage. He held it up to the light. He swirled it, listening to the liquid lap against the crystal walls. Swish, swish. He took a sip. It tasted like victory. It tasted like oak and berries and vengeance. But he wasn't done. The business was finished, but the heart was still waiting. He set the glass down with a soft clink and walked out of the library, through the grand hall where his footsteps echoed like applause, and up the service stairs. He moved toward the staff quarters, a part of the house he had never visited. He walked down the narrow corridor, listening to the hum of the lives behind the doors. He found her number. Room 4B. He stopped. He took a breath. He knocked. Tap, tap, tap. The door cracked open. Tiana stood there, wearing a simple cotton robe. But she didn't smile. She flinched. She looked at his hands, checking for blood. She looked at his eyes, searching for the madness she had seen downstairs. She took a step back, her hand gripping the door frame until her knuckles turned white. "Mr. Valenti," she whispered, her voice trembling. I haven't told anyone. I swear. Please." Enzo stopped cold. The look in her eyes wasn't love. It was terror. She had heard the screams from the cellar. She knew the monster had woken up, and she thought she was next. "Tiana," he said gently, keeping his hands visible and open. "Do not fear me." You hurt them," she breathed, tears spilling over. "I removed the cancer," Enzo said, his voice dropping to a low, soothing rumble, distinct from the command he used on his enemies. "But a surgeon does not harm the heart. And you." He took a slow step forward, giving her time to retreat if she wanted. "You are the heart." He waited. He let her see him. Not the boss. Not the killer. But the man who was drowning in noise and needed her anchor. Tiana's grip on the door loosened. She saw the vulnerability in his gray eyes. Enzo, she corrected herself, her fear slowly giving way to something softer. Enzo, he repeated. My name is Enzo. And I think I like the way you say it. He looked at her. He listened to the hum of the small radiator in her room. He listened to the distant sound of the city outside the window. But mostly, he listened to her. He listened to the rhythm of her breathing, the subtle shift of her weight, the beat of her heart that he could almost sense across the threshold. I heard them, Enzo said, his voice raw, stripped of all the armor he wore for the world. I heard everything. The lies. The plans. The years of betrayal. I heard it all. Because of you. Tiana lowered her eyes, her lashes casting shadows on her cheeks. I didn't know if I should. I was afraid to touch you. I was afraid I was wrong. You were the only one who wasn't afraid, Enzo said, stepping into the room. It was small, humble, smelling of lavender soap and old books. Everyone else saw a king to be feared or a cripple to be used. You saw a man with a blocked ear. You saw the human being underneath the suit. He reached out and took her hand. Her skin was warm, calloused from years of hard work, alive with a pulse that matched his own. You gave me the world back, Tiana, Enzo said, his voice dropping to a murmur that was more intimate than a touch, a sound meant only for the two of them. You gave me the wind and the ocean and the music. But none of it sounds as good as your voice. Tiana looked up at him, tears pooling in her dark eyes. She saw the loneliness in him, the decades of isolation melting away like snow in the rain. She didn't see a mafia boss. She didn't see a killer. She saw a man who had just been born, a man experiencing the universe for the first time. What happens now? She asked softly. Now. Enzo smiled, and for the first time in his life, it wasn't a practiced expression for a business deal. It was real. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. Now, we change everything. I have a lot of listening to do. And I need someone to tell me what is real and what is a lie. He leaned in, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear, the very anatomy that had started this revolution. Say my name again, he whispered. I want to memorize the sound of it on your lips. Enzo, she breathed, the word shuddering through her. Again, he murmured, his hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Enzo. He closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him like a baptism, cleansing him of 37 years of silence. The screen fades to black, leaving only the sound of two heartbeats, finally finding the same rhythm in the dark. Thump thump. Thump thump. Enzo Valenti wasn't just deaf, he was blinded by trust. But when the silence broke, the monster woke up. He cleaned house, not with a gun, but with the truth. He took back his city, his life, and his heart. And he learned that sometimes, the loudest love isn't screamed from the rooftops, it is spoken in a whisper in a small room at the end of the hall. If you made it to the end of this story, you are part of the family now. I want you to drop a comment below. Tell me, would you have forgiven the uncle? Or did he get exactly what he deserved in that cellar? I read every single comment, and I want to know whose side you're on. And listen, if you enjoyed this journey, if you felt that tension in your chest when the glass shattered, smash that like button. It helps us bring more of these twisted tales to life. But most importantly, subscribe. Hit that bell icon. Because the story of the Valenti family is far from over. There is a new queen in the house, and the city is about to get a lot louder. You need to be here when the next chapter drops. This has been Afro Soul Love Tales. Until next time, keep your ears open, because you never know who is listening.